Our objective today is to share with you information about the Invisible Woman project and our goals to raise awareness about the vulnerability of women in all their diversity as they age, and to explore some of the understandings about that with calls to action for what we can all do to address this, what I will deliberately call man-made problem of the inequality and the vulnerability for women as they age. I'm just going to first share a little bit with you, and then we'll go to a panel discussion with our experts on the stage here, representing the nuances of diversity and the issues that impact on women and lead to their vulnerability as they age. So just a few little points to have in mind. I should also say that I'm Jo Cavanagh. I'm the convener of the Invisible Woman project, and our profiles are on the app, so I'm actually not going to waste our precious time sharing too much of that with you. I'm sure you can go look and find out a little more. So we actually have a burning platform for change, and the Invisible Woman project grew out of research that was emerging earlier about the increase in homelessness amongst older women. So when we actually began the project, we were alarmed, like many, to find that older women were now the largest group of homeless in Australia. And that in 2016, we actually knew that there were 49,000 women in Australia facing homelessness every night. We were involved in some research to understand what was actually happening for those women, what was propelling women into homelessness. And from the research that we did, we kind of came up with these 5 Ds that happen in women's lives: domestic and family violence, divorce, disease and disability, dearth of dollars from both income and superannuation, and for some, the death of a partner. Problem onset for women could be created over their lifetime with unequal income, or it can be created as shock events happening in their lives for which they're ill prepared. We also learned that the strongest protective factors start with a strong social network outside of family relationships, but also family relationships. A network of caring friends and community who step up and in to look after each other. The role of networks can mean a big difference when people have these shocks in their lives. So if I could just ask for a show of hands in the room of who knows women over 55 in this room? Pretty much everybody. Who has loved ones and relatives who are over 55? Well, there we go. This is everyone's problem. It doesn't belong to older women. It's everyone's problem. So the problem starts with gender inequality. The differences in pay, employment status, and progression actually widen as women age in our society. The Australian Government Workplace Gender Equality Agency has not traditionally included questions about ageism and gender in their annual surveys, but they are now adding it in. So to just review quickly where we've got to in the last 3 years of the Invisible Women's project, which is a group of interested people who've come together with a passion to raise awareness and then encourage action. We started back in 2019-21 with our research. We've then moved on and were successful in a funding partnership with the City of Melbourne. Then our clever teams at Just Gold, who are also responsible for putting these slides together for me, have really made this a social project with the website, site launch and socials. The reference group, which I chair, is established. And then if we move on, we've been able to go interstate with the City of Adelaide coming on board with a local project there to raise awareness and help to bring women together to share their stories and the voices of women of all diversity. Part of our objective here is to not have the usual suspect up on the stage talking about this, but to actually dig deep into community and hear the voices of women who are less well known. Through the social websites that have been developed, you can see there the reach that we now have of increasing people's interest and engagement with the project. We're very excited about the interns that we've got working with us from RMIT and the University of Adelaide, who are bringing the expertise of their academic institutions and their brilliant ideas to the fore in helping us grow awareness and progress into solutions. So if I could move to the next slide. Key to our project is creating grassroots connections, so opportunities to bring women together and share their stories, helping to give attention to those stories, pushing it out through the digital content. There are various podcasts and little videos that you can see through all the social media platforms, but we're now really progressing into business to get business engaged, because the source of the vulnerability goes back to gender inequality in the workplace in particular. So we have some big goals for the next couple of years to address these issues. So what I'd like to do is invite you to go to our website and learn more about that. But now I want to invite our panellists to share their perspective. So from where we started, we now understand that there is so much more about intersectionality that we need to unpack and draw to people's attention. Gendered ageism is now a thing. The OECD has now really launched that as a forum to explore globally. But we know it's more than that. We know it's a bigger story. So I'm going to ask each of our panellists to just briefly introduce themselves and then bring their lens, their nuancing, what else is involved in here, because it's not a one-size-fits-all issue. Tania, can I ask you to introduce yourself and you commence, please?
Thanks, Jo. I don't know if everyone can hear me. I'm generally pretty loud anyway, but hopefully this mic is working. So firstly, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to come and talk about a project that's really important in not just its issue, but its scale and potential magnitude. It's really important to be able to have these discussions. So, as Jo said, I'm Tania Farha. I'm the CEO of Safe and Equal. Safe and Equal is the peak body for specialist family violence services here in Victoria. Before maybe saying a few more words, can I just add to my acknowledgement of country? This is the first time I've spoken, so can I acknowledge that we're meeting on Wurundjeri land here, unceded lands, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I think it's really important thinking about Aboriginal culture, how important it is that they hold elders at the centre and the heart of their culture. I think we in Western society have a lot to learn from Aboriginal communities in this respect, particularly in the context of this discussion, I think. So I guess I'll just say a little bit. I mean, obviously you can see what my interest is in this. I mean, Jo's already talked about the fact that family and domestic violence is has a huge impact on women and women's lives as they age. So I guess I was just going to say a little bit about that. Just before I do that, I just want to also recognise victim survivors. We do this work for them, and given the prevalence of violence in this society, it's inevitable that there'll be some people here who have experienced it and or still are. So I guess just a little bit more context about us and what we do. So we work with practitioners and leaders to bring grassroots feminist issues to the public policy arena, particularly as it relates to ending violence against women and others impacted by gender-based violence. So in doing this work, we're acutely aware that older women are often overlooked in all aspects of social policy and social life. So as we work to improve the family violence system, we have to take into account the needs and experiences of older women, and we must focus on the changing social ideas that drive violence against women and other communities. So I guess challenging and changing social attitudes that affect older women need to be part of our ongoing efforts, both in the response area, but both in the primary prevention area too. So that's the part of work where we stop violence from happening in the first place. And obviously addressing the drivers of this form of violence, which are particular expressions of gender inequality, are really, really important to this work. So I guess with an ever-increasing proportion of Australia's population that is aged 65 and over, and I understand the deadline for the Invisible Women's Project is a bit younger than that, I guess actively considering and responding to the experience and needs of older women should be critical in our goal to end violence against women. So I just want to say something too at what's happening at the federal level. Many of you who are Victorians would be more familiar with the outcomes of the Royal Commission into family violence and all the work that's been happening to address that. Obviously, the needs of different cohorts was drawn out in that Royal Commission report, and older people was a consideration there. But also the newly launched National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Their Children highlights that for older women, gender-based violence includes forms of elder abuse, ongoing intimate partner violence, economic abuse and control perpetrated by adult children and other family members. So many older women experience the compounding negative effects of taking on multiple unpaid caring roles, which can affect their employment and economic security, reduce superannuation balances, and mean they have limited control over finances and decision making. I just wanted to highlight a study, many of you probably heard or saw this, that Anne Summers earlier this year released a research report that looked at the data from the Personal Safety Survey. If you work in the sector, this data wasn't necessarily surprising, but what Anne managed to do was analyse this data in a specific way that was able to bring the concepts and the ideas simply to the broader community. Because basically what she found is that single mothers faced dire economic consequences and were the largest proportion of single people, so basically single women, of the greatest proportion of single mothers in this country were facing or had faced family and domestic violence. So if you think about what that means, the resulting economic consequences for leaving relationships, which we know are potentially homelessness, financial insecurity, lack of superannuation, continue to plague women from those days onwards to when they age. And then, so basically what it is, we have a tragic and unacceptable reality for women of the choice between violence and poverty. That's essentially what that study found. And I guess if you think about the statistics that Anne just talked about older women facing homelessness, much of this is actually driven from days when they left relationships and then continue on through their life because they're always behind, because they can't catch up. There are lack of opportunities to get back the superannuation that you've lost out on. You've got to retrain, get back into the employment market. There's a whole lot of issues that face, and with all the gender barriers as well, exacerbates this. And if you think about how gender inequality, experiences of family violence intersect with other forms of oppression and discrimination, so those issues that must face the Aboriginal community, issues that face culturally diverse migrant refugee women particularly, you can see how that would be compounded. Women with disabilities. So all of this is compounding women's experience, not only as younger people, but as they age. So I might stop there because I know some of our other speakers are going to talk more to the intersectionality. So
thank you, Tania, and I think, thank you. Linking it to the earlier session, if you were here, about the failures of capitalism, again, we can see that many of these problems are, in fact, man-made problems. They are structural, systemic and cultural problems is the source of them. It's not to pathologise the individual women who find themselves in these circumstances. And if it's a man-made problem, that means it has solutions, because we can stop doing it and we can do better things. Jung has kindly joined our session, having had one of our speakers have to withdraw. So she's going to introduce herself and share from her work that she's doing on racism.
Hi everyone, hope you can hear me as well. It just doesn't feel like the mic is on when you're up here. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Kind Enterprises, to ask me to be here today. I thought I was coming down to just enjoy the speakers, and then I was asked to step in, which I am privileged to be able to be asked, but also to be able to articulate some of the work that I've been dedicating my whole career and my whole life to. So, my name's Dung Tran, so Vietnamese heritage. I think the Jung and the Tran gives it away a little bit. And when I saw the topic for this session, ageism, the invisible woman, am I really that old? Because I don't see myself at the age that I am. I won't tell you how old I am, but I don't think I behave in that way. I don't think of myself as aging. I see myself as a young spirit, and that's because, and I'll share with you my history, my heritage, because I think it's really important for me, and I think for many others, in how it shapes us, but what drives us, and what we decide to do and pursue as our purpose. And I think a purpose is really important for many of us. It's not so much if you don't subscribe to the purpose construct or concept, it's also your why, right? Think of it as your why. Why do you do the things you do in the world? Get up in the morning and just battle. I put on my armour every morning and I go out and battle, and that's how I teach my children as well, because we need to create a more socially and racially equal society and a planet. So I live and I navigate two worlds, in that my Vietnamese heritage is very important to me. It is prioritised in my home. I live within an extended family. So my 100-year-old grandmother is still living, and I take care of her on the weekend. During the week, she's with my parents. And we have a very small family, a very small extended family here in Australia, only because of the pathway in which we came to Australia. And I spent the first 5 years living in Vietnam as a young child, in poverty, in a very, very poor rural village near Nha Trang. So 10 hours from Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon. And it was I have memories back to when I was 3 years old, but it was the most happiest memories, because as I was sharing with someone at lunchtime, I remember my grandmother putting me on her back and going out to the river and collecting shells or catching fish in her basket, her handmade baskets. And she still tells me the story of how we survived, how she fed us as a family, how she created illegal alcohol to sell to the returning soldiers, who are the guerrillas who are out fighting against the Viet Congs. So for me, my family and my story and how I've come to Australia as a refugee has really instilled in me the why of what I do now as a professional, as a volunteer, as a leader in the community, as just another human being, interacting and sharing stories with everyone I meet, and kindness and compassion. And we do that with kindness and compassion so that we can bring people along. And so I have a professional career as a counsellor, a trauma counsellor, only because, back in the early days, because I could see the trauma of newly arrived refugees, the waves of migration that we've had across Australia. But for me personally, it was our Vietnamese community, where we were told that you push your trauma aside and you go and you work in factories and you just raise your family and you instill in them the ethics of hard work and listen to your boss and just nod and don't create waves and don't stir, right? And you just accept what you get because you're lucky to be here. You're lucky to be here. You should be grateful. And that was the narrative. That was the programming and the conditioning that was given to me. And so growing up in a home where my mother and my grandmother were the decision makers. It was a matriarchal family unit. My father was there, but he went along, loving man who just supported us unconditionally. So I grew up with that, and that's who I am and shaped who I am today. And in my work, I don't see that. I am invisible at work because it's not my age that they see first. They see my ethnicity, they see that I'm a woman, and I am invisible in so many spaces. I've gone to business meetings where they think that I'm the secretary, when I'm a co-founder of a social enterprise charity, non-profit. I've run businesses, for-profit businesses, and I've been judged where I walk in, this woman cannot speak English very well, maybe, she's not educated. So the stereotypes hits me before I'm able to speak, before I'm able to share, before I'm able to express the knowledge and the wisdom and the skills that I bring to the table. So I co-founded a social enterprise, but now we've got charity status, and it's exciting because it's a whole journey, what you do and what you want to do in the world. And we're called Our Race. Our Race Community is our non-profit, and what we do is what I know best. It's storytelling and how stories have been commodified, particularly refugee stories have been commodified by organisations, by media, by political systems, by systems in general, where it doesn't acknowledge the beauty and the spirit of that story and how powerful that story is, and that the story holder has agency, the communities has wisdom to share, like our First Nations communities around the world, around this country. We forget that. And so what we do at Our Race is we advocate for the creative ownership and control of the story holders' stories when they want to share that, if they want to share that or not. And we create tools and resources to elevate and centre their voices and their stories in platforms and spaces that they want to be in or be heard in. And we work with organisations to also encourage them to provide the resources that is needed, the psychological and cultural resources to make sure that, they are supported throughout that whole journey of storytelling.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful story. Calling out beautifully for us that in some cultures, ageing and elders are actually valued. Some very important lessons for Western society to learn. And also I think Yung has called out for us too, where the beginnings of vulnerability happen in the workplace, when women are seen first of all by their visual presentation and not for who they are, and not the opportunity to be valued and automatically judged or pigeonholed or stereotyped in some way. Thank you. Maria, can I ask you to join the conversation and share with us from a cultural lens too, to build on what we've already done?
Yeah, and I think, so much of what you were saying really resonates because am I supposed to introduce myself?
Just saying, I think people know who you are, but anyway.
They should by now, especially given Holly's gone around talking all night. Holly's really regretting that. I think that, a couple of things that I just quickly want to say, because I do want to make sure it's conversational. But I think feminist scholarship has actually improved the visibility, and I talk about the politics of visibility and the politics of vulnerability, because I don't think vulnerability or invisibility is inherent. it's created, as I think we've been saying. And it's very much about power and power disparities in our society. And as the previous panel was saying, intersectionality as an analytical tool to assess that power is really important. And the question then it becomes about power sharing. But in terms of how I translate some of the, just very quickly, some of what Yung was saying before, I think about growing up in Australia as a migrant to this country, coming to a country without any English, and reflecting back on some very strong memories of my mother trying to sort of defend us, really. That's one particular scenario where my brother and I were accused of bringing a disease, I think it was head lice, into the school even though we didn't have it. And she speaks 6 languages, but was derided, and I think, you know, it still makes me feel quite emotional, derided on the basis that her English wasn't very good. And I think about as a child who's probably 8 years old, feeling embarrassed by her, and that she couldn't speak English, that my brother and I had sort of acculturated and acquired, you know, English fluency. But many, many years later, thinking as she aged, as a woman working in a factory all her life, and thinking she had no agency, and falling into that trap of victimhood, because that's how she was characterised as a woman. All with, I mean, deficits were really the only description that were provided to her. And watching her age until we went back to Greece. I've been back many times, but it was the first time she'd gone back. She would have been in her early 70s. And it was then that I realised her power, because in the village, she had wisdom. In the village, she was someone who was valued. And I thought, my goodness, structurally, what has that done to your sense of self? And I think that even now, despite the feminist scholarship that has contributed to, as you said, a gendered analysis of ageism, I don't see intersectionality applied even in that, whether it's gerontological or it's feminist analyses. The role that culture, ethnicity and migration plays in our understanding of ageing is still very absent. And I think that is the politics of invisibility. It contributes to experiences like Jung's, like my mother's and so on. So collectively, I do think that until we think about those processes of power disparity, whether it's ageism, whether it's sexism, whether it's racism, they're all connected and compounding. And they impact profoundly on our mothers' lives, on our lives as we age. But I want to hang on to the image of Mum in Greece, where she held power. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a lovely image. Thank you, Marianne. So we're going to sort of have a bit more of a conversation now, continuing and building on this conversation. And I know that it has been suggested that people could put questions in the app. I will do my best as an ageing person to go to the app and find the questions at the appropriate point in time. But you know, one of the things that happens as you age is your hard drive gets very full. We know shit. And we have to delete some of it in order to pick up some new stuff. So you have to prove to me that your new stuff is more important than what I already know before I'm going to delete my files, okay? So I will have a go.
Like it.
So let's continue with this idea about ageing and ageism. So apparently, according to the OECD, the whole idea of, or the concept of ageing, or ageism, comes from somebody back in 1969, I can't remember his name, but he was actually calling out the fact that we despised ageing. So hence, ageism is coming out of such a negative attitude towards ageing. And in our youthful culture, and the fact that we glorify everything young, new, bright, shiny, we miss out on some of the things that other cultures, and our First Nations culture too, have known for a long time. So can I ask us to build on this too, and perhaps you might share a little bit, Tania, too, from your own lived experience. When you think about ageing around you in your family, your culture, is this a negative stereotype, or how do people actually talk about it?
I don't know, I guess, like Maria and Jung, I grew up in a culturally diverse community too. My parents were Lebanese migrants to this country. And I guess lots of what I've heard resonates with me. I think, you know, one of the interesting things is regardless of what your own culture or your own community thinks about age or ageism, when you are acculturated, that's a very good word actually, Marie, when you are integrated or acculturated, you take on those those characteristics of the society that you live in. So I guess just thinking and listening to what Maria and Jung said, that yes, I think in certain communities there is respect for older people, but when you migrate to countries like this where shiny new things, that's what you remember, you know, and that's what you take on, you know, and I guess I was just trying to think through some of those things, and it's hard, I think, for migrant refugee people to come here because they see that their children change, they see that their families are changing because they're trying to fit in, and we did that too, you know. And I wish I knew then what I know now, because I would have been much more comfortable to be who I was then. But you're so busy just trying to fit in and not be different, you know, and it's scary. And I grew up in a small country town too, so you can imagine there weren't too many Lebanese people around. So even more the drive for that. So I don't really know how to answer the question.
Well, but in there is an insight about the value of ageing, because you know things now that you didn't then. And I think that's one of the things that we want to change in our society. When we're looking to understand issues, who do we ask? Where are the voices of women in that generally, and then the voices of women who have lived experience through different ages to contribute to that? Jung, would you like to add?
I think within the Vietnamese culture that I operate in, and I'm deeply aware of the biases that exist there, because youth is very much valued, and it's not just youth in, say, the West, in the Vietnamese, through the Vietnamese lens, youth is tied to colorism. Because I'm often, my mother would say to me, because I'm fairer, right, I'm prettier than my sister, my younger sister. And so when I had my daughter, who's 21, she's darker because she takes after my father. Oh, you need to lighten her skin. But even before that, before I gave birth to her, it was, you need to drink coconut juice, fresh coconut juice every day, because that somehow will change her skin tone, and when she is birthed, that she is white. And so youth is very connected, right, to, for us, the whiteness. So we're living, right, in this whole society, this world that is based on whiteness and the power that goes with that and the privileges that goes with that. So it has threaded itself into, yes, the culture, a migrant culture, not so much. If we were back in Vietnam, in a village, in a rural village, I don't think it would be as heightened. But because we're here and we're exposed to information, we're much more connected to our communities because we are smaller, and you tend to gravitate towards your own people, right? You get information from there. And then you're exposed to the Hollywood movie, the marketing, right, of what beauty looks like, and then that then connects to youth. So for me, I get the privilege of going home and seeing my 100-year-old grandmother, and not only sharing stories, but looking at her as an elder within our family. And like Maria, when she goes to Vietnam, when she was younger and she was allowed to travel and go back to Vietnam, she commands an audience. That's how respected she is. The knowledge and the wisdom she has is phenomenal. And when she's here, she's locked up. When I say locked up, we don't lock her up. It's good socially, right?
Got the CEO safe.
She's confined to her home because the individual society which we live in, we don't associate with our communities. We are not out there within our communities. Our identities doesn't extend, right, to our communities. It's a nuclear, it's an individualistic society. So you shut your doors at 6 o'clock. You have dinner at home and you watch TV and you go to bed and that's it. You don't talk to your neighbour, you don't hear about them, you don't interact with them. That's not where we've come from. And so that's the two worlds that I think we definitely try to navigate. And it's again, you know, looking at where does that the youth or the idea of what young looks like and how do we aspire to that. I am challenged by it every day, but then I have hope because what I learn and what I see and what I experience, I am conscious, and I think we all need to be conscious of this, or else we'll be walking blindly into just continuously perpetuating this global narrative of what society, marketing companies, like large brands, tell us. And so we need to question that, but we need to say, no, we can't do this anymore. Like Sabrina said, we need to imagine a different way of doing business, but also different ways of talking to ourselves and talking to the next generation, the girls and the young women coming up. And I'm responsible for that with my children and other young women around me.
If I can just build on that and the whole idea of creating connections, and we do have some questions in the apps about creating connections. But let me share with you first of all that the part of the research that's been shared as part of the global campaign to combat ageism is that its detrimental impact on health ranges from reduced healthcare access to loneliness. So loneliness has, the US Surgeon General has recently compared to the negative health impact of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So loneliness has the same negative health impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Like poverty, ageism is a non-medical factor shaping one's health, and so is now considered a social determinant of health. So our attitudes towards ageing, combined with loneliness and lack of opportunity for community, is now a social determinant of poor health as we age. So Maria, in picking up, what's some of the opportunities you've seen in different cultures that have perhaps over time built, because the Greek community is a very strong community. Are there places and spaces where older people come together? Are there examples there that can show us how we should be doing that here and now?
Jo, let me just unpack that a little bit because, and this is a conversation that I hope all of us can sort of engage around, but it's the way that we use these categories as well. So I talk about obviously concepts being embedded or grounded in cultural lenses. For me, one of the issues, and this is reflected whether it's flawed data collection or it's even around how we do research, is that until we problematise this idea of what is culture, we're going to keep using it, I think, in a way that doesn't necessarily yield the sort of results that we want. And that is that I think culture is all too often used synonymously with ethnicity, and they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I was thinking too about the previous discussion, I'm diverting just a bit, around family and domestic violence. For me, family and domestic violence is an expression of culture. But the minute that you attach it to ethnicity, it becomes a problem. Because it's not about some ethnic groups are more violent than others, but is it an expression of cultural ideas and the way that we value people? Absolutely. I mean, I would argue, right now I'm doing some work for the AFL on their multicultural policy. Let me tell you, the AFL has some culture problems going on there. So I think when you ask about the cultural sort of aspects, culture is also impacted by migration. And so to that extent, many of our communities, the Greek, the Macedonian communities, experience what Professor Mary Kalantzis talks about as the frozen culture. And I like to give this example, and friends of mine who know my mother, you know, will chuckle each time, but I grew up with my mother lamenting the fact that my brother and I had really lost contact with this amazing Greek culture. Unlike my cousins in Greece who showed respect for their elders, they were considerate. They came over decent hours of the night, this litany of, you know, what your cousins do in Greece and how fabulous they are. Until, of course, I travelled back to Greece at the earliest stage that I could, 18 or 19, in search of these cousins that I've now come to detest, absolutely detest, because that was the measure, right, of success. And so, of course, you all know what happened. My one cousin, your cousin Nikos, he's in prison right now. Your other cousin, oh my God, was she alive or somebody? I'm not really sure who did. I wrote down every single detail, came back and said to Mum, guess what, Mum, they're as lousy as we are over there. And she said, oh my God, they're not Greek. That's what it is, they're actually not Greek. So who is Greek, Mum? What she was reflecting, obviously, is what Mary Kalantzis talks about as the frozen culture. And of course, culture becomes a protective factor. It becomes a way of hanging on to values and ideas that were more prominent for her in the 60s than they are in, you know, when she went back. In fact, she cried for days because, you know, it wasn't the culture she left behind. And so that's the thing, I think, the impact of migration and that process that Tam was talking about before, and how it shifts and changes the way in which those communities give value to these things. The point about we're now caring for our elders in isolation. I go back to Greece and there's a whole bloody village looking after the elders. I've got to drive home tonight to Geelong to a father who's dying because it's just us that are looking after him. That's the isolation that I think individualism creates. So even whilst we might, in theory, celebrate the idea of collectivism, I still think we have to negotiate what culturally we feel in our hearts to the reality of a society that gives ultimate primacy to individualism.
Absolutely, and I guess if I could add to that, I too am of a migrant family, first generation Australian, of English parents who demobbed here after the Second World War. So we grew up with war-torn Europe as very much part of boil the chicken and, you know, don't waste anything and all the rest of it. But I grew up in a very socially isolated family because they brought their white tradition with them from England, which is don't tell anybody if there's any problems, and you never ask for help, and privacy is absolutely critical, stiff upper lip and all of that sort of stuff. So you can see how, as part of the colonisation story and then the reinforcement in the first waves of migrants after the Second World War, reinforced that Western attitude around individualism and, you know, not belonging to the wider community. Or if you did, it was through the rugby club where everybody seemed to hit each other. Anyway, I'm going to ask my magic question as in wrapping up our session today. Thank you all for sharing so generously with us. But I have this superpower and I'm going to share it with you. So Maria, I give you my superpower. If you can change one thing in the world, what's it going to be?
Make Hala stop calling me old. No. Wait, is Hala still here? Where are you, Hala? There you are! See? Look, if there was one thing that I could absolutely change, it would be, could we stop universalising people's experiences? I think because that process of universalisation essentially, I think, means that our humanity is lost in that process too. And the panel before, you know, I was thinking about the ethics of love and Bell Hooks' concept of the ethics of love as a foundational principle. I think if we could reclaim that ethics of love in the way that we engage around our differences, it would not be a bad thing.
Thank you. Tania, you now have the superpower.
Yeah,
What's the one thing you're going to
It's hard to
change?
follow something so profound, but
Well, you just might want everybody to have enough money to live on. Yeah.
look, I don't know what the one thing is. I mean, I work in an area that requires a system to change it, you know, so always thinking about what's the one thing that's going to change, it's really hard to think about that. But I guess in thinking about what drives the reason why we need to do this work and about those rigid social norms, stereotypes, I would hope one day we can break that down so people have the opportunity to express themselves how they want to express themselves. Obviously not hurting other people, but if that was that would go a long way, I think, to some of the discrimination and the oppressions that we experience that drives the reason why I have to do the work that I do. So if I could change something, I'd like to see those kind of negative, you know, social norm stereotypes break down and individual expressions, not so much which contributes to this idea of non-universalising, because it is about people being able to express themselves safely and to be accepted.
Valuing diversity and equality. Young, you've got it now, you've got the superpower, what's your one thing you're going to change?
World peace.
She likes walks on the beach.
No. I hate the ocean. It's nearly killed me coming here.
Point taken.
So many things, and I struggled like enormously with this question. But if I have to pick, it's really investing more resources in empowering girls and young women to not believe, you know, that the identity that's given to them from birth. So empower them to own their own identity, to go out there and find greatness for themselves.
Thank you. Well, that segues nicely, yes. Back to the intention of the Invisible Woman project and our efforts to raise awareness and then create through the social platforms, but also with some face-to-face activities that have been funded through the City of Melbourne for here and in Adelaide, but moving in now too with business, opportunities for women to come together, build those social connections, share their stories and be part of creating the solutions that we need in our society to make sure that young women today, and I think of, you know, my own daughters and now granddaughters, I don't want them to go through what I went through, but we're not making enough progress. If you listen to Julia Gillard's wonderful podcast, A Podcast of One's Own, she was interviewing recently and shared that the United Nations has said that at the current rate of change to build equality for women, it will take 130 years. And because of the pushback that's happening, it's now probably going to take longer, unless the power of democracy and people and grassroots and sharing comes to the fore to change that. And we do know it is people that actually bring about change, not governments. It's people who want to change the conversation who then change the government, as we've seen so beautifully happen recently in terms of an exercise in democracy where people come together and organise to start a different conversation and provide different opportunities. Could I ask you to please go to the Invisible Woman website? I think the information is in the conference pamphlet. Sign up, join up for our newsletters, help us to amplify those voices. In 2023, we're looking to start conversations in the workplace and encourage women to be telling business what needs to change. We've also had some wonderful kick-off to that with Anne Sherry recently sharing at the Institute of Company Directors, Directors Update, a real both barrels to business about talking about the workforce shortage and forgetting to look at who's already here in Australia and are excluded. You know, older people, older women, people with different kinds of disabilities who also have abilities, people of diversity of all sorts, to break down those barriers and give everyone an equal opportunity to participate. So please join with the Invisible Woman Project. Can I ask you to go home and talk to older people in your families, in your circles? Find out what their experience is. Be curious about their lived experience. What stories have they got to tell you? I think my grandmother would have told a very different story to your 100-year-old grandmother about, the exclusion. She never lived in a society where she was valued. So go home and find out those stories before you lose them. Because one of the things that we all share is we are actually all ageing, and all of us won't be here eventually. So best you collect those stories now while you can. So could you join with me in thanking our panellists for sharing?